Just starting the recording.
Okay.
And we're good to go.
Awesome. Let me share my screen. Cool. Awesome. So thanks for having me. Today, I'd like to talk a little bit about this question of, as a software developer, how do you work with a designer? And so this is a topic I'm really passionate about, partly because as a designer, I rely really heavily on software developers to make things real. And so this collaboration and this relationship is something that I view as really important, and I'd love to talk about it a little bit. So a little bit about me. I have worked in tech for a little over 10 years. I started at a company called Puppet, which is in Portland. And Puppet is where I made the transition from software development to design. So my background is actually computer science. But when I worked at Puppet, one of the things I came to realize was that I love the act of writing code and building software. But what I love even more is making sure that we're solving the right problems for the right people and doing it in an excellent way. And so I made the leap over to product design, and I've spent most of my career in design. But I also still love writing software, so I like dabbling in both. And I've also spent a little bit of time doing product management. And so one of the things that you learn as a designer is that it's not only important to design solutions for users, but it's also really important to make sure that you're building stuff that is viable and that makes money for the business. And product managers are all about that. And so there ends up being kind of these three roles that have to work really closely together to make stuff happen. So you have your software developers, you have your designers, and your product managers. And so today I work at a company called DataStax, based in the Bay. And what DataStax does is they are a database company. And so they have two main products. They have AstraDB, which is a NoSQL database, and they have Astra Streaming, which is the product that I work on, which is all about getting data from point A to point B. And so I really love working on these really technical problems for developers. It's what I really love doing. So what does a designer do? And so I guess I'd like to ask all of you, what do you all think designers do in their day to day? What's your exposure to designers?
And you can either chat in the chat box or unmute yourself, however you like to answer the question.
Do they like design interfaces that users will actually interact with? The layout, the aesthetics,
Yep.
Functionality, ease of use?
Yep, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, totally. So so visual design is kind of what most people think of first when you think of what designers do. And there's lots of different elements of visual design that we're involved with. So things like color theory, what colors look good together, branding, like when people look at your product, does it remind them of your company? Do those things look similar and cohesive? It has to do with things like typography, like do the words on the page, are they legible? Are they appealing to look at? And then animation, how when someone's going through an app, does it feel like it's flowing and giving a sense of continuity? But this is actually only one of the areas that designers are concerned with. And so you might find that you get to work with a designer who's a visual designer and they specialize in this area. But if you're a generalist like me, then you end up doing lots of other stuff in addition to this. So another area is interaction design. And interaction design is all about making sure that people can get from point A to point B in your app to accomplish certain tasks that they have. So it's less about how it looks and more about can people actually navigate it and get their jobs done. So some of the things here involve workflows, which are about kind of mapping out what those journeys in your app look like. Wireframing, which is understanding structurally what your app looks like before you're ready to put in the visual polish. And it also involves things like prototyping. So one of the cool things about being a designer is that often you can see whether something would solve someone's problem before you have to write a line of code. So one of the things that we do a lot of is something called low fidelity prototyping. So what happens is that we'll either sketch on paper or do sketches in a digital whiteboarding tool, and then string those sketches together in a clickable PDF that lets people kind of tap and click through your design before it's been built. And then something else that we do is think a lot about accessibility and information architecture as well. We want to make sure that anybody is able to use the products we design in a way that is natural and benefits everyone. Another area that designers are really involved with is user research. And I think of all the specializations, user research is the one where you're most likely to get to work with someone whose specialty is user research, because there's so much depth in this area, and it's something that takes a lot of years of practice to really get skilled with. But some of the things here that designers will involve themselves with are things like personas. And personas are really important because when you're building software, you want to have a very vivid picture in your mind of who it is that you're building for. And personas are what let you do that. And so a persona is essentially a description of a particular class of user that tells you a little bit about them and what they're trying to do. And usually comes with a photo, so you can kind of visualize them as you're working on design and building out of the software for them. User researchers also obviously engage in a lot of conversations with users. So they'll do things like discovery research, where you have a list of hypotheses that you're trying to validate, and you'll set up a conversation and talk to people and get a sense of whether your hypotheses are valid or not. And then user researchers will often also pair with software developers and designers after a solution has been partially or entirely built, in order to sit down with users and see if they're able to use that design, prototype, or that software to solve their problem. And so they're really involved through the entire product development lifecycle. And then the final area, and this is kind of what I want to talk about the most, because I think it's often overlooked, but it's vitally important, is process. So something else that designers do a lot of is making sure that the product development lifecycle is going smoothly, and not in the sense that you're trying to ship as fast as possible, but in the sense that you are shipping the right thing as efficiently as possible. So there's a lot that goes into this. But something that you'll notice if you work with designers in your career is that designers are very, very interested in rapid and regular feedback and iteration. And so what you might find is that a designer will come to you and they'll have a really rough sketch, and they'll say, this is a solution that I think could solve our user's problem, and I want to know how difficult is it going to be to build this? Because one thing that most designers don't necessarily have is a good grasp on that feasibility and the difficulty of implementing something. And so you'll find that you have to work together to make sure that you're not only solving the right problem, but you're solving it in a way that's not going to take you months to build. Designers are also responsible for a lot of kind of workshop facilitation. And so there are often cases where they don't want to be the one person in a silo trying to come up with a design or an interface. And so they'll pull in other designers and software engineers and do workshops to kind of work together to ideate and formulate solutions, and get them to a place where you collectively as a team feel like you're able to have confidence in the thing that you're building, and then move forward and implement it. And so this is just kind of a snapshot of the different sorts of things that a designer might do in their day-to-day. But an obvious reaction to this is, this is awesome, but how does this impact my life as a software developer? So this is kind of what I want to talk about, because I think it's really easy for designers to get really busy and have all this stuff going on, but to not stop and think about this importance of collaborating closely with our peers in engineering and product to have the best possible outcome. So at the end of the day, I think what's most important is to get stuff shipped, because until you ship something, it's not having any kind of impact on the world. And so, designing the perfect interface and taking months to do it is probably not the best approach when you could ship something that's maybe not perfect, but starts to have an impact right away and gives you real feedback that you can use to iterate on and make it better. And so if shipping software is ultimately what we're trying to do, why do we need designers at all, right? Because engineers can build software and they can ship software. So remember that shipping software is done because a user has a problem and we think that we can solve it for them. And so shipping software is essentially a way to address this problem that a user has. But it's really, again, it's not enough to know what the problem is and then to ship software that you think will solve the problem. It's important to ship software that solves the problem in a way that's exceptional. And the reason why you have to do this is that if you ship a solution and the solution kind of sucks or it just doesn't work very well, that user's not going to be super happy. And they're probably going to run away to your competitor, or they're going to find somebody else who can solve their problem better, or they're going to try and solve it themselves. And so you really have to solve the problem well. And the only way that you solve a problem well is by truly understanding who it is that you're solving the problem for, and making sure that you're able to validate your solution every step of the way. So ideally, you won't get to the point where you're shipping some software that you've never run past a user and don't have any insight into whether it's going to meet this bar of solving the problem well. So this is where designers really become essential to the process, because at the end of the day, what we're about is eliminating risk. We want to make sure that you don't get to the point where you have to rework the entire piece of software you've just built because it wasn't solving the problem well. And so we're working really hard to make sure that by the time you get to ship, you know that the thing that you're shipping is going to work and it's going to solve the problem. And so at the end of the day, happy users are what we want. And if we make them happy, then the next time they have a problem, they're going to come to us, and this loop's going to continue. And so we want to end in this virtuous cycle where we're shipping great software, and by shipping great software, we're afforded more opportunities to continue shipping great software because we're building trust in the people that we're solving problems for. Now, the reason why this doesn't always work is because of this thing called a silo. And essentially what a silo is that if I'm working as a designer and I'm on my design team and I'm just like sitting in a room with whiteboards all day and designing solutions, if I don't talk to my partners in engineering or product, the thing I design, it might solve the problem, but it may be impossible to implement or really difficult to implement. And so that's what a design silo looks like. On the software development side, I've worked with teams who didn't have a designer. And so I came on the team and found that their process was essentially where they have a product person or some other stakeholder in the business side who has a solution already fully formed in their mind. And they say, we need to build this particular solution. And so they write down a document describing their solution. They hand it off to engineering. Engineering just rolls with it and builds that solution. But no one's bothered to talk to users or see if the assumptions that the stakeholder is making are accurate. And that's kind of what an engineering silo looks like. And so you end up shipping a lot of software that doesn't really solve the problem very well. And so you end up reinventing the wheel and having to go back to the drawing board a lot. And I'm not going to talk about the product silo too much. That's not really the focus of this talk. But there are also situations where the business knows it needs to make money, but it doesn't do a great job of making sure it's solving real problems for people, or making sure that it's building software that is easy to maintain, that lets you have this tight iteration, and so you end up in another situation where you just aren't shipping the right software for the right reasons. So where the magic happens is when you're not working in an environment that has these silos, and instead everybody's talking to each other and everyone's working together during the entire product development process. I think there's this trope that when designers are done designing, there's this big handoff where they toss their designs over the wall, and the development has to catch it on the other side, and that's really not at all ideal, because you want to make sure that both people are working together so that there aren't surprises and there aren't these big handoffs that happen where people have to make do with what they've been given. So what I'd like to do is have us imagine that we're starting a brand new project. And so we're about to go through this entire product development lifecycle. And what I want to focus on is what this interaction between designers and engineers looks like as you're going through this process. And so as software developers, what I'd like you to be thinking about is, as I'm building software, where are situations where having a partner in design can really make my life significantly better and help me move faster and ship software with less risk. And that's really what I'd love to get out of this today. So the first step in any new project is discovery. And so what discovery is about is you don't know what problem you want to solve. And so what you got to do is you got to get into the market, you got to talk to users, and you got to understand what problems exist that you could theoretically solve. And at this point in the process, it's really common, I think, to just assume that the business folks are doing this and figuring out what needs to be built. But the reality is that you want everyone involved. And so it may be that the researcher on the team, or the designer on the team, or the product person on the team is facilitating the interviews, and they are, they're running them and they're asking the questions and they're synthesizing all this information. But as an engineer, it's really important to be involved in the discovery process, because when you're building something, it's one thing to be told what to build. It's another thing to be told, why you're building it and to be told who you're building it for. But it's entirely different to actually sit on a Zoom call with somebody that you'd be solving the problem for and see them say what their problems are, and to kind of express that firsthand, their frustrations and their needs and their desires. And if you are able to see that firsthand, it has a really powerful impact on your ability to imagine them as you're building software later on in the product development lifecycle. So I really encourage anybody to be involved during discovery and to be a part of that process, because it makes for more clarity later on as you're actually building the thing. So the next step is requirements. So once you've done all that discovery work, the next step is you need to synthesize it and figure out what problem that we're going to solve now. Chances are there's way more than you could possibly do. So you got to pick one or two things and really focus on those. And so again, this is, I think, traditionally seen as the domain of the product person, where they're combing through all that knowledge they've gathered and they're putting it in a spreadsheet and picking out the one or two things that are most important. But what requirements are also about is it's about understanding what things will have the biggest impact on users' lives and their jobs. And so this is where designers are spending a lot of their energy, is understanding the users and kind of like who you're solving problems for and what their pain points are. And so obviously we're really invested in this. But again, this is an area where it's really important to have engineering involvement too. And the reason for this is what I mentioned earlier, where you don't want to end up in a situation where you decide you want to build a solution regardless of how much it costs. And so it's easy to get into a situation where you decide that X is the most important thing you could build, the most important problem to solve, but it's going to take months or years of effort. And without having an engineer in the room to provide that input, you're not going to pick the right thing. And so it's important to have all three people, represented in this stage, so that you're able to understand the trade-offs and make the best possible decision. This is not something you want to offshore to somebody who's doesn't have that technical expertise. Okay, so ideation is next. Once you know what problem you want to solve and you've picked a problem that's about the right size for what you can build, the next step is ideation. And so you have these three people. You have your designer, you have your researcher, and you have your product person. And what they're doing is, at this point, they're trying to figure out what's the full galaxy of solutions that we could build that would solve this problem. Chances are there's more than just one solution to any given problem. And so here, what you want to be seeing is designers are going to be probably facilitating a workshop where they're going to start sketching out ideas that could solve the problem that you've identified in the market amongst your users. But what you want is you want to have your product person in the room as well as the engineer. And the reason why you want this is that depending on what domain you're solving the problem in, these people almost certainly have unique perspectives and input that a designer by themselves isn't going to have. Now, for me, I work in the developer tools industry. And so I end up working on products that are primarily used by developers. And so what I often find useful is to bring developers into this ideation process, because given that they are like the people who are going to be using these products every day, it's really important to give them an opportunity to both tell you kind of what ideas they would have for things that they would want to use to solve these problems, so that they're able to feed that input into this process. Otherwise, you can end up with a lot of ideas that like sound great to somebody who's not exposed to that particular domain, but end up really not encompassing all of the solutions that you could possibly build. So the next stage is prototyping. And so this is where I think engineering shifts from being primarily an input into really making stuff real and to making this happen. And so there's different levels of prototypes that you can build. And there's almost certainly a type of prototype that's appropriate for any point in the development lifecycle. So early on, when you have ideas that are very loose-grained and not very detailed, what you might do is you might put together a paper prototype. And a paper prototype is something where you have those wireframes that the designer is sketching out, and they're just putting them into a clickable PDF or similar that lets people actually try out the solution before you've had to write a line of code. But in a lot of cases, you end up solving problems that are really difficult to validate unless you're using the user's actual data or you're doing it in their actual environment. And so for a lot of prototypes, you actually want to go to code and start to build things that let you validate these solutions in a more natural setting. And so these live code prototypes become a situation where engineering is vital to make them happen. And so at this point, you don't really care about building something that's production ready. You don't have to write tests, but you absolutely need something that's a little bit more real than what a designer could put together on their own. So often a designer will come to the development team and they'll say, hey, I think we need to validate this particular solution, but we can't do it without building something that's real enough to interact with and use someone's actual data. And so when that happens, what I love is sitting down with a software developer and kind of talking through the solution and what it is that you're trying to validate. You can pull it into the research process, and then you can work together to basically mock up kind of what this prototype needs to look like. You can build it really quickly, build it in a matter of days or maybe a week, and then you can set this in front of users. And so this is where you can start to really dig into the usability of the solution that you are devising. And so the higher the fidelity of this prototype, the easier it is to evaluate how well this is going to work to solve someone's problem in the real world. So once you have this live code prototype, you can start to put it in front of users, and you can observe them and see how easily they're able to use the software to solve their problem. So again, as an engineer, it's super interesting to sit in on these usability sessions and watch people trying to use the software that you've put together. And it gives you really a sense of immediacy, and it makes you it makes it easier to empathize with people when they struggle to find a particular button or to understand a concept that's in your software. And so when I sit with software engineers who are in these sessions, often they come out super energized and they're like, like it was really hard to watch that, but now I want to go and fix all their problems. And so I love trying to pull software developers again into the research, into these usability tests, because it really, I think, makes this whole process come alive for them. Okay, so let's talk about the refine phase. Now, one of the messy things about product development is that it's it's often portrayed as this linear path. So you start without an idea of what you're building, you end with this, polished, perfect solution. But the reality is that there's a lot of looping back, and you might get partway down this path and realize that you're going down the wrong direction. You have to like start over again, or you realize that you're actually not solving the right problem. You have to go back and pick a different problem and keep going. And so often you'll get to this point where you just have doubts and you're not sure if this is the right thing. And one thing that I found is that when you're building software, it's really difficult to make software that works in production. And so sometimes you'll get to a point where you've put together a prototype and the prototype works well enough for you to do usability testing. But when you like try to take a little bit further and try to actually like make it live in production, maybe there's a backend API that doesn't exist, or that would be really hard to retrofit to make the prototype work in production. Or maybe you find that it's just not performance enough. And so then you have to go back to the drawing board and you have to say, okay, well, is there an easier way that we could build this that would let this thing, make it easier for this thing to get into production, even if it's slightly different than the design that we've been testing and validating. And this is, I think, where that design and engineering collaboration is the most important, because when you're working really closely with someone, you're aware the moment that something just doesn't feel right or isn't proceeding as smoothly as it should. And when you have all these experts that collaborating in this tight way, that one of them can raise their hand and say, I don't feel good about the direction this is headed from a design perspective, or I don't feel good that we've built something which is going to be easy to maintain from an engineering perspective. And then you can go back and continue iterating through this journey until you've built the thing that's right. And that everybody, has a feeling that the thing you've built is right. A company that that has a really interesting perspective on this is Basecamp. And one of the things that they talk about at Basecamp is that it's not enough to define metrics for success and to say, if we ship software and it, meets these metrics, it's good. What you often hear instead is, do we have, are we proud of the thing that we shipped? And if any point along this journey, you just don't get the sense that you're proud of what you're shipping, that's a really good signal that, it's probably time to go back and like loop back through this process until you get to a point where you're really proud of what you're shipping. And it's not just checking the boxes or, making sure that you hit certain metrics. So there's definitely a pride of craft here that is really important to get a handle on. But let's say you've made it through that morass and you're at a point where you are pretty sure that you are done and that you're ready to ship this. Validation is something that you have to do throughout the entire process, where essentially you have to be taking risk off the table and making sure that you're talking to users and you're iterating on low fidelity solutions that you're showing them, and you're making sure that every time you go to spend a little bit more energy and effort to make your solution real, you have confidence that you're building the right thing. But there has to come a time when you just say, it's good enough, it's not perfect, but it's good enough, and we're going to ship it. And so there's this usually a final gate where you show your final prototype to some users and just get that final confirmation that this is good enough to ship, and we can keep iterating on it if we need to. And so you get to that all coveted point at which you're shipped. And this is often where you're acknowledging that the thing that you're shipping is done enough that we can move on to the next thing now. And maybe this is the fourth time you've released iterations on a particular feature, but after that fourth time, it's working well enough that we're done. And this is again something that really needs the input from all of these roles in order to understand if you've reached that point. A designer might see people using the software that you shipped in a production environment and then see that they're not able to solve their problem as well as you thought they would back when you were testing it at a lower level of fidelity. Or maybe an engineer sees that, oh, as we're scaling this up and it's getting more users or using it more heavily, performance again is starting to suffer and we need to rethink things. But ultimately, you can get to a point where it's solving the problem well enough, it's performing well enough, it's solving the business needs well enough. We're proud of it. Let's move on and do something else. And so like that is the product development lifecycle, and that's how that collaboration between design and engineering, I think, can really shine when you're working closely together and you're making sure that you're every step along the way you're checking with the other role to see how they're feeling, getting their input, and that's really where the magic happens. And so the other thing that I've observed in my career is that as a UX designer, often people assume that as a designer, you're primarily interested in desktop and web UIs and mobile apps. And the reality is that designers are concerned with the entire user experience. They're concerned with anything that a user might come into contact with in your company or your product that impacts the experience they have with your company or your product. So I wanted to kind of close briefly with a few examples of non-traditional areas of a product or a company or work that you might encounter as a software developer, where it can be really useful to have a designer to work with because of kind of their interest in making sure that the user's interaction with your company or your product is as seamless as possible. So one example of this is APIs. And I love this example because APIs are traditionally seen as something that backend developers primarily care about, and it's not something that a designer would ever need to see because they only design the front end that consumes this backend API. But there's a couple of areas where it's really important to get their input at this level, and one of those reasons is that the front end UI that you build is very, very much connected to the backend capabilities that are made available. And so as you're designing a backend API, it can be really useful to talk to the designer and understand what it is they're trying to do on the front end to solve the user's problem. And by having a deep understanding of those tasks that they're trying to solve for, it can help you build the backend in a way that a designer is able to get what they need and solve the user's problem in a way that's elegant and doesn't have compromises that ideally they wouldn't have. The other situation is that you might be working on a product that is for a technical audience, and your audience of developers perhaps will be actually using your API. And so in that particular situation, the API is the UI. And so as a designer, we're super interested in making sure that our end users, regardless of their technical acumen, are able to use that interface that we're building for them. And so if you're building an API for developers, then something a designer can help with is making sure that the names of the parameters or the endpoints in your API are things that make sense to your end users and that are intuitive. It can be really useful even to run usability tests of an API if this is the product that you're building. The other area that I think goes beyond what most people traditionally think designers are responsible for is documentation sites. So one of the things with products is that often products come with documentation because it's not intuitive how you would use the product without referencing this kind of external source of information about the product. And so this is really important to us as designers because when you're using a product, every time you have to context switch and move to a different tab in your browser or open up CLI or go somewhere else, it kind of breaks your flow and it makes it more difficult for you to stay committed to the task that you're trying to solve. And so if as a developer, you're writing documentation or you're building out a site that your end users will use for documentation, it's important to talk to designers not only for how the documentation site looks, but also to better understand the situations in which someone would need to go off to that documentation site and trying to minimize those situations. So putting some documentation in the product so that they can most of the time get all the way through their task without leaving the product and only going to the documentation when they need to. And this is something that's also really useful to usability tests. So you might sit a user in front of your product and see if they're able to, successfully get through a particular task and solve their problem, without having to go to the documentation site. Yeah, this is a really big area, especially with developer tools, where it's very, very common that it's a domain that they themselves aren't super familiar with. And so understanding kind of what their learning journey looks like alongside the docs. And the final example are internal tools. And so you might find in your career that you're being asked to build a tool that's something that only internal people at your company are going to use. And it's easy to think that these tools don't really need a designer because they're not something that an end user will ever see. But the thing is, the user experience spans not only the product, but it spans the website, it spans support, it spans all of those touch points that a user is going to have with your company and its products. And so if your internal tool is, for example, designed to make the life of a support person easier, there's going to be an indirect impact on your users, because that support person is going to, hopefully have their job made easier so that they're able to respond more quickly to support requests or respond to more support requests. And so understanding, those touch points between the user and the people who are going to use the internal tools that you're developing is really important. And so pulling a designer in to understand what that journey looks like, it can help you understand, situations when it would be useful to have a designer's opinion on a particular tool, or even to consider how you might make that tool even better for your internal folks, if you want to treat your internal folks like end users. So those are just a few kind of examples of areas where it can be useful to pull in a designer or collaborate on stuff that isn't necessarily strictly part of the end user facing part of your product. So that's about it. I do feel like it's really important in this industry to remember that we're all like on one team, we're all in this together, and that designers sitting by themselves or developers sitting by themselves is really not the best way to build great software that solves people's problems. We're better together, and I think that the longer I'm in this industry, the more I like to see designers and engineers sitting side by side and solving real problems for real people. And that's it. Thank you so much for listening. And if there's any questions, I'm happy to tackle those. Or if you want to think about this and reach out to me afterwards, I'm also happy to respond to stuff async.
And attendees are welcome to ask questions in the chat in the right-hand side, or you can just unmute your mic and ask Daniel any questions. Now, looks like Robert has a question. Robert, we can't hear you. Can you unmute your mic at the bottom? Yeah, you can post your question in the chat if you just want to type it out.
I also put Daniel's LinkedIn in there. If you want to reach out to him, you can go to that link and connect with him.
I guess my question would just be, in general, what's the most gratifying part of your job, the most rewarding aspect of it, and what do you find the most challenging in your line of work?
Yeah, I think what I love the most is when So I guess a little story. When I worked at Puppet, one of the most special moments was when I was in an interview with a user of Puppet, it's a DevOps automation tool. And he told me that Puppet made him not hate his job anymore. And it saved his career essentially, because he was about ready to burn out and give up because he was so tired of the toil and the effort of configuring thousands of servers manually. So for me, like, the most gratifying thing is when I see the things that I helped design have an impact in the real world and really make people's lives better. Like that's the best thing. Yeah. One thing that I find really challenging is that it's often the case when things that you build just aren't the right thing. You have to throw them out and start over again. And even as someone who's been trained to like not get too attached to ideas and to attach to my solutions, it's still really hard when you get, all the way to maybe a live code prototype and you just have to admit that it's not the right thing. So that's the challenging thing.
I could imagine. Well, thank you.
Yeah, totally. Looks like Nick is asking, are UX designers expected to be good at art? I love this question because I hear it a lot. And the truth is that you don't have to be good at art, but it certainly doesn't hurt. My background is in computer science. And I didn't go through the training to be a designer like a lot of designers did. And so one of my weaknesses is actually visual design. And I really admire designers who have that really strong art sense and ability to create a composition that just really pops and feels delightful. So it's not a skill you need. Especially if you are a designer in a technical domain where you don't expect consumer levels of visual polish. But it's a fun thing to study, and I admire people who are good at it. Okay, another question. Do you need to do some front-end engineering work as a designer? This is another good question. There's really strong opinions on this. So some people argue that designers should not code because the act of coding kind of constrains your thinking as to what's possible. So you end up designing solutions that are easy to build because you know that they're easy to build, instead of designing the best possible solution and then putting pressure on product to like spend more time and prioritization towards those solutions because you know that they're the best solution for your users. The other perspective is that if you do know how to code as a designer, it makes it way easier to collaborate with engineers because you can file PRs, you can change color, like you can write CSS, kind of how the process works. And when I work with developers who know that I code, it really helps them, I think, respect opinions that I put forth because they know that it's coming from a place of empathy for their jobs and what my designs mean for them. So I think it's like, my personal opinion is that it's great to know how to code as a designer. And if you have any curiosity at all to do both things, I highly recommend it, but you don't absolutely need to. Yeah. And let's see, question from Robert. I used to work for the feds, and I was often struck by how much work it took for our software contractors to get a full understanding of our workflow. Do you have any software tools or general approaches that you think are particularly good at documenting workflow and user preferences, et cetera? It's a good question. So in general, I really like whiteboarding tools like FigJam or Miro because it's really easy, I think, to like get in a meeting with people and talk about stuff and not write anything down, or to like sit down with people and write a huge document that nobody else reads because it's just too dense and hard to digest, versus putting boxes on a digital whiteboard and drawing arrows between the boxes and like grouping the boxes and more interacting with like the requirements as a visual like workflow. So my personal favorite tool at the moment is FigJam by Figma, because Figma is the tool I use for design, and FigJam is a great whiteboarding tool that's part of Figma. And so Figma makes it really easy for people in different disciplines to get together and like put boxes on a screen and just talk about the boxes instead of just saying words and not thinking, not be able to visualize what other people are saying. So that's my personal favorite from a workflow perspective. Oh, thanks. Yep, that's the tool. Okay, question. What resources, like websites or networking groups, do you recommend to continue learning more about being a software developer working with design? That's a great question. One thing that I think is a good so one area where I think you see a lot of this kind of collaboration talked about is design systems. So like Google Material Design is probably the example of this, where it's kind of the intersection of the design process with the code. And so design system is all about like developing patterns that you can use in your design, and then have the code alongside them that you can use to really quickly implement and build up these patterns. So I think if you Google for design systems, Medium probably has a lot of good articles on this. You can find a lot about the process of building design systems and the collaboration that requires between engineering and design to make that be successful. Yeah, design systems are, I think, probably the best place to start there.
Any other questions? I also put in the wrong link in the chat box for Daniel's LinkedIn. I'm sorry, it was the previous Tech Talk speaker, but check out Samantha's comment there. She linked it, thankfully. Thanks for looking out, Samantha. But no questions?
Well,
And
Daniel, I do. Oh, sorry, Regina.
No, go ahead.
Daniel, no, really good presentation with the product development lifecycle. Now, do you work with maintaining and doing updates with the software developer lifecycle? Do you work much in that?
You mean, do I contribute from a code perspective to?
Well, code and design with doing updates just through the lifecycle of the product.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say most of the projects I work on are like this thing already exists, and now we have to make changes to it or improvements. So yeah, I'd say like probably 9 out of 10 projects are kind of in that camp where you're like contributing to something that's like already past its initial release, and you're just trying to make it better.
Gotcha. And did you, when you said you work for Puppet, was that Puppet Labs in Portland?
Yep, that's the one.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we took our students for a tour there a couple of years ago. It was a great setup in the offices there, and students really enjoyed it.
Nice. There's a lot of really good people there. My favorite part about working at Puppet was, I guess like most startups in general, is startups are cool because they're working on like problems that haven't been solved before. And so if you really enjoy like working on brand new stuff, like from scratch without, prior work or prior releases, startups like Puppet are like the best place to go to find opportunities to do that. And so I definitely recommend like that as an avenue of exploration, depending on what you really enjoy.
Yeah, it was a great creative setup, and they had a really good buffet.
Nice.
It also looks like there's some other questions in the chat box.
Yeah. Any hints on getting designers, devs on the same page regarding what to call things? That's a good question. I do think, again, like design systems are a great way to do this because you put the code alongside with the design, and you have to describe it. And so I think that's a good way to get your vocabulary, like at least with respect to what you're building, on the same page. But I think this is also just a common struggle. People calling things different things and miscommunicating. And I think it's something that I think ultimately, like writing stuff down and like having documentation that you both are committed to like building together is really the biggest way to avoid siloing on terminology and stuff. So I'm leading a team of UX designers, UI designers, and UX researchers on a small project. I don't know any software engineers. How do I reach out to them? Oh, interesting. Yeah. This is a tough one because I've struggled with this too, where like if you want to get something done, you have to find like cross-functional partners to work with you. And ultimately, I think it's kind of a networking problem. Like you want to, ultimately, you want to find people that are excited about the same things that you're excited about, or they like working with you because they've worked with you on projects in the past that have gone really well. And I find that when you build those sorts of relationships, if you reach out about something you want to build or something you want to do, they're way more likely to give it a shot and try it out. That's what I've found, but it is challenging because I know as a designer I kind of end up in my design bubble, and it's easy to find collaborators within my design bubble, but it's a little bit harder when there's somebody else who has a different full-time job that's separate from mine to get them to like spend some of their precious time working with me. So yeah, it's a good one. Now I have to drop, but I'll take this last question. Advice for a dev who is newer to tech, who has been passionate about design long before they learned to code and wants to incorporate that passion into their career. Yeah, so this one is something that I really think about a lot because this was my journey. And what I would say is that design is, I think the thing about design is it's partly about I think it's partly about trying to go through the process and of designing things and building a portfolio and becoming someone who has a firsthand like knowledge of like the act of doing design. And then as a developer who has like a whole another set of complementary skills, who can actually execute on the things that you were designing, you can really become a generalist who's able to go very broad across like design and development. And that's a skill set that's very rare and it's difficult to find amongst designers. And so if you have passion in design and you also have the ability to write code, putting those two things together, I think, can make you really attractive on the job market. And so that was my path, was essentially joining Puppet as a software engineer who was on the UX team as a prototyper, essentially. And so that gave me a bridge to becoming a designer by way of my software engineering background. So I would highly recommend like internships or looking at areas where you can join a UX team as someone who writes code for the team, maybe in a prototyping sense. Oh, cool. Yeah.
All right,
Awesome.
great
Thank you
talk,
so
Daniel.
much.
Yeah, thanks y'all. This is fun.
Yeah, thanks for being here. And like I said, you can always reach out to him on his LinkedIn, and the recording will also be posted in our YouTube channel. So if you want to go back and watch that, you can definitely do so. And then here's the schedule for next week's Tech Talk. Oops.
That was great. Thank you.
Take care.
Yep. Next week we have someone coming in to talk about artificial super intelligence. So it's going to be a really interesting topic. If you want to join us, you can most certainly do so.
That's exciting.
And yeah, really cool topic. And also here's just a tree link of all of our social medias, our YouTube channel, our Instagram, also our school website and our books that we've published. So if you want to check all those out, you can just click on that link tree and it'll take you all there. So thank you all for joining. And I hope you guys have an awesome weekend. Hopefully I'll see you guys next week. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks again. Have a good weekend, guys.
See you guys. Bye.
Yeah,
Bye.
Thanks for coming out. Thanks for coming out. Take care.
And number 2.
Just you and I. So yeah, good call on the recording.
For a second, when you first said it, I was like, weird. I didn't hear the recording noise. But I have my screen split up, so I was like, oh, okay, so you probably just did it and I didn't hear it.